Welcome to the Dibley Diaries for this week. I've been short of filming time, so we're going to have it all filmed here essentially because it's been too hot to film outside, and I'm just taking a brief pause in the weather that we've got so we can film outside just now. So today in the Dibley Diaries we'll be thinking about Matthew chapter 18, beginning at verse 15 through to 20, where Jesus is talking about disputes in the church and how to resolve them. And I just wanted to spend a moment thinking about the rural challenge of having these very small church communities who are gathered as Christians in a village, and the village will have opinions about the church as well, both the building and the community. Someone phoned me up once from a local radio station and asked me about what was happening in a different church, which was having a really bitter dispute. And he said to me as part of this, "Janet, why are people so agitated about it? Why are they so upset about it?" And I said, well, the thing is, in these places, the communities, the village communities and the church-going population and community in that place, people are really strongly emotionally involved in these issues. They think that they are right, and they also think that God is on their side. So it doesn't help when you're trying to resolve a dispute in that way. That becomes very entrenched in people's ideas. It's a real challenge for us. I've spoken before about the fact that in a rural community, people have different church worshipping styles, of theological understandings. If they're gathered together in a rural place to worship, they will be very different people, and they might not like each other very much. And you know, that's okay. People won't like each other, and they won't necessarily like each other for all sorts of different reasons, but we're not called to like each other. In the Romans passage that goes along with the Matthew 4 today, we're reminded about Jesus telling us to love one another. And there have been times in church communities where I've preached on this before, where I've said, well, you don't need to like the other people in your church community, but you do have to love them. And that's the challenge for us, working out how to resolve disputes in a way which people may not like, but people will be rooted in that understanding of their love for each other as Christians, even though they know or acknowledge that they might not like each other very much. The thought for the week this week is based on Matthew chapter 18 verses 15 to 20, where Jesus is talking about disputes within the church. So something happens in the church that you should go and talk to the person and try and resolve the issue. Then you should take some people along with you, and then you should try and resolve it and then see if you can, and if you can't, then there will need to be a sort of break away from that situation with somebody leaving the church community in that place. But then Jesus finishes that little bit in the gospel by saying this reassuring thing that whenever there are 2 or 3 people gathered together, then he is there with them. Jesus is there with us when 2 or 3 are gathered in his name. So this is both a very challenging passage and a very reassuring passage, especially for the rural church. In the rural church we have often got very small congregations, but we need to know that Jesus is there with us, which is the reassuring part. But the challenge is also about how do we deal with the disputes which arise within our church communities. How do we deal with that, and how do we remember both those things, that in any situation where we are gathering to discuss church things, Jesus is with us. Would that moderate our behaviour in some of those church meetings where we are agitated or concerned or upset, or we fundamentally disagree with another member of our community? I've been in some really amazing church communities in my time, some which are full of love and care and support for each other, and I've also been in some church communities and some church settings where the kind of, the young people would say the beef between two people, the upset between two people can affect the relationship of the whole church community, and it can be a really difficult situation. How do we deal with that? How do we cope with that dispute and that conflict in our own church communities? I had a friend, and I thought this was really inspirational at the time. He had a really, really difficult meeting happening in his PCC, his church council meeting, and what he said to them was that they were not going to spend more time discussing this situation than they were praying about this situation. And he was very resolute about this. He was chairing the meeting, and he said, okay, we're going to pray now. And they prayed for a certain amount of time, and then he pressed stop on the timer, and he said, okay, we'll talk now. And when they talked for as much time as they prayed, he stopped them again and said, okay, we're going to pray again now. We are going to pray about this, and then once we've prayed, we'll discuss it again and we'll carry on. Now, that was an extraordinary thing. I was particularly awestruck by that. I thought, wow, that is really bringing home the fact that Jesus is there with them and part of this discussion and this dispute. What is it? How do we resolve these things? I've never done that. I've never said, actually, we're going to pray about this thing as long as we've talked about it. I think perhaps, having seen his example, I would think about it if I had to chair a meeting where there was going to be that sort of discussion that was going to be so difficult. I would maybe do that. But what does it bring to our discussions? I mean, it is reassuring that Jesus is with us. We're in a small congregation, there's maybe 6 people there, and we don't put Jesus down in the service book as the 7th attendance, but we know that he's there with us. That's the reassurance. But also the challenge of that is, how would I modify my speech or my behaviour towards someone else if I knew Jesus was standing right beside me, watching every action and knowing every thought that I'm having towards that person? What would it be like for me? How do I make that my reality? How am I conscious of that? I remember being at a church meeting, I think it was Dawson Synod, where there was going to be a difficult discussion, and somebody prayed this wonderful prayer where he said, may our words be soft and sweet, because the chances are we are going to have to eat them anyway. And I thought that was just such a good way to open a difficult meeting. So this is our joy and our challenge from this passage in Matthew. We remember and are reassured that Jesus is with us whenever 2 or 3 people are gathered in his name. But if we remember that when we are gathered in his name, would Jesus be pleased with every word that we uttered from our mouth or every thought that we had in our community? The Dibley Moment for this week is not necessarily a comedy moment, but I've been reflecting this week that Geraldine in the Vicar of Dibley was actually really good at conflict resolution within her community. She always thought of creative ways of sorting things out, and she would find different ways. There are a couple of things where she does things to resolve this conflict which absolutely would not be allowed, and at some point I'm going to do a reaction video, I think, on some of these things where I sit there and go, she would so be sacked for that. But I wanted to talk in the Dibley Moment today about some conflict resolution which happened in a rural church, who were arguing about whether to have mugs or cups and saucers. And people got their real knickers in a twist about this because people were arguing that they needed to have mugs. It was important. People would feel homely and welcome in the church community if there were mugs, that they wouldn't have they wanted to feel at home in the church building. And then other people were like, well, we have to have cups and saucers because cups and saucers are smart, and it's really important for people who have trouble holding heavy things, that we have cups and saucers. And there are occasions, how would we do the cream teas if we didn't have cups and saucers? You wouldn't want to do the cream teas with mugs. And this argument raged for 2 or 3 PCC meetings, so over about 6 months. And what happened in the end was the vicar got really fed up and went to IKEA and bought 50 sets of cups and saucers and 50 mugs, and just presented them to them and said to people, if you're making tea or coffee for people, you choose which of these you want to use on that occasion. And everyone went, oh, okay. Because why did they only have to have mugs, or only have to have cups and saucers? And so they lived then happily for the next 10 years. So the youth group used the mugs. The working parties in the church building used the mugs. Often on Sunday mornings they used the mugs up for tea and coffee after the service. Sometimes they would give someone a cup of saucer. After the midweek service they had cups and saucers, because older people there didn't want to be able to lifting a heavy mug. The cup and saucer, 2 cups in a cup and saucer, was much easier to lift. The person who had the tremor always had a mug, and it was half full, so that actually when they were trying to get that to their lips, it didn't bother them so much. They weren't going to spill it everywhere, and they certainly couldn't hold a saucer and a cup. And for the cream teas, everybody had cups and saucers. It was a simple and very pragmatic solution to what had been quite a bitter church argument, just by somebody going, oh, for goodness sake, let's just have both. And so, whilst it's not a comedy moment, it is a moment that I think Geraldine would have done. I think Geraldine would have made that trip to IKEA as the Vicar of Dibley and just bought cups and saucers and mugs and told everybody to just behave sensibly when they needed to sort things out. That's it for the Dibley Diaries for this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, have a really blessed and harmonious week.